I always parked on the third level of the parking garage. It was a habit, a routine so ingrained in me that I never thought twice about it. My apartment complex was a mid-rise building in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Denver, and the garage, though dimly lit and eerily silent at night, had always felt safe. That night, I got home later than usual. Work had run long, and by the time I pulled into the garage, it was nearly midnight. As I drove in, my headlights cut through the rows of mostly empty spaces, casting long shadows against the concrete pillars. The air was thick with silence, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant sound of traffic from the street below. I turned into my usual spot, cut the engine, and exhaled. Just as I reached for my bag, I saw something that made my breath hitch. A figure, hunched over, next to a car a few spaces away. At first, I thought it was just another resident, maybe struggling with their groceries or fixing a flat. But something felt off. The person wasn't moving with purpose. Instead, they were fidgeting, glancing around, their posture tense. Then I saw it. Their hand working at the car door handle, a slim metal tool glinting in the dim light. My stomach nodded. They were trying to steal the car. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Get out, lock my car, walk straight to the elevator, and forget I ever saw it. But as I gripped my keys tightly, my heart pounding against my ribs, I hesitated. What if it was my car next? I knew I should call the police, but my phone was buried in my bag and fumbling for it would draw attention. I could feel my pulse quicken as I debated my options. Then, the thief looked up. For a split second, our eyes met. A flash of recognition, of shock, and then something worse. His hand dipped into his jacket. Fear jolted through me. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I yanked my door shut, shoved the key into the ignition, and turned it so fast that the engine roared to life before my seatbelt was even on. The thief bolted. I watched in the rearview mirror as he took off toward the far exit of the garage, weaving between cars, his silhouette vanishing into the dim light. Adrenaline surged through me, clouding my thoughts. Should I follow him? Should I drive straight out? Should I wait for the police? I did something I still question to this day. I put the car into drive and turned toward where he had disappeared. My headlights swept over the rows of parked cars, casting eerie moving shadows along the concrete walls. The air in the garage felt heavier, pressing down on me. I turned a corner, expecting to see him running toward an exit. But he wasn't there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept forward, my foot barely pressing the gas. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Then, a shadow moved. Before I could react, something slammed against the back of my car. I jerked forward in my seat, my breath catching in my throat. My rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. A moment later, a loud bang echoed through the garage. Someone was yanking at my back door handle. Then, a whisper. Muffled, barely audible, but unmistakable. I see you. Panic took over. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires screeching as I shot forward. The car lurched, my head snapping back against the headrest. I didn't stop to check if he was still there. I sped toward the exit ramp, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911, my breath coming in shallow gasps. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my parking garage, trying to steal a car. He just tried to get into mine. I reached the exit gate, punching the keypad so hard that my knuckles stung. The barrier lifted agonizingly slow, the seconds stretching impossibly long. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see him running toward me. But when I looked, he was standing completely still, just a few yards away, watching. Then, he raised his hand and mimicked turning an invisible key in an ignition. The gate lifted, and I floored it onto the main road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked outside a 24-hour gas station, still gripping my phone like a lifeline. The police took my report, but there wasn't much they could do. Security cameras in the garage were old, blurry, and unreliable. By the time officers arrived, the thief was long gone. They told me to be careful, to always check my surroundings, to park somewhere more visible. I moved out of that building 3 weeks later. It's been years, but I still think about that night. About the split second when I locked eyes with him. About the sound of my door handle rattling. About the way he just stood there at the end, watching me leave. And I wonder, What if my car hadn't started in time? And worse, what if he had been inside my car the whole time? It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. My wife, Anna, and I had just returned from the grocery store, our trunk filled with bags of food for the week. It was a crisp winter night, the kind that made you shiver when the wind cut through your jacket. The underground parking lot of our apartment complex was nearly empty, its dim overhead lights casting long shadows across the concrete. I had always felt safe in our building. It was a mid-range apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but secure enough that I never questioned my surroundings. That night, however, something felt different. As I turned into our usual parking space, I noticed him. He was standing near the far end of the garage, partially hidden behind a concrete pillar. His posture was unnatural, rigid, as if he were trying to blend in but failing miserably. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I put the car in park and glanced at Anna. She had noticed him too. "Do you see that guy?" she whispered. I nodded. "Just stay in the car for a second." I stepped out of the car, pretending not to be bothered. The trunk popped open, and I began pulling out the heavier bags. Anna followed my lead, though I could tell she was uneasy. As I lifted a bag, I stole another glance toward the pillar. The man hadn't moved, but something about the way he was positioned felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. Then, just as I shut the trunk, he shifted. He started walking toward us. Not fast, not aggressive, but with a sense of purpose that sent a chill down my spine. My grip tightened around the bag handles. Anna noticed too. "Let's go," she said quickly, grabbing my arm. We turned toward the elevator, moving as naturally as possible, but the tension was palpable. The doors to the elevator were only a few steps away. "If we could just get inside before, hey." His voice was low, almost casual, but there was something in it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated but turned around. "Yeah?" He was closer now, maybe 10 feet away. His hands were stuffed in the pockets of his oversized jacket. His face was unshaven, eyes dark and unreadable. "You got a light?" he asked. It was such a simple question, so absurd given the situation, that for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "No, sorry," I said, my voice more tense than I intended. Anna was already pressing the elevator button repeatedly. The man nodded slowly, but he didn't move. He just kept staring. The elevator doors finally slid open, and we hurried inside. I pressed our floor number, and Anna hit the close door button several times. As the doors started to shut, the man took a step forward. For a split second, I thought he was going to lunge, but he didn't. The doors closed, cutting him off from view. Anna exhaled sharply. What the hell was that? Back in our apartment, we tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just a guy looking for a cigarette. Maybe we were overreacting. But as I sat on the couch, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The way he stood there, the way he walked toward us, the way he hesitated at the last moment. Something wasn't right. The next night, I had to run downstairs to grab something from the car. Anna was already in bed, so I grabbed my keys and headed down alone. As soon as I stepped into the garage, my stomach dropped. He was there again, same spot, same posture. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 other men with him now. They weren't talking, weren't moving much, just standing near the same concrete pillar. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I forced myself to act normal. I kept my steps steady as I made my way to my car. As I opened the door, I chanced one glance over my shoulder. The 3 of them were watching me. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking. I backed out of the parking space, making sure to avoid eye contact as I drove toward the exit. Just before I turned onto the ramp leading out of the garage, I saw movement in my mirror. They were walking toward my parking spot. Back in the apartment, I locked every door and window. Anna woke up when she saw my expression. "What happened?" I told her everything. The next morning, we reported it to the apartment management and the police. The security footage was reviewed, but nothing incriminating was found. Just a group of men standing in a garage. They hadn't committed a crime. I never saw those men again after that night, but the experience stayed with me. It was a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. Sometimes it lingers in the quiet corners, waiting for the right moment. I learned to trust my instincts more after that. To always be aware of my surroundings, to never dismiss unease as paranoia. Because that night, my instincts told me something was wrong, and they were right. Now, whenever I enter a parking garage, I scan every corner before stepping out of my car. I keep my keys ready, stay alert, and never hesitate to turn back if something feels off. I've lived in the same apartment complex for 3 years. It's a quiet building in a relatively safe neighborhood, the kind of place where people nod at each other in the hallways but rarely engage in conversation. The underground parking garage, though, has always given me an uneasy feeling. Something about the way the fluorescent lights flicker, casting harsh shadows against the concrete walls, makes the place feel hollow, lifeless. That night, I got home later than usual. Work had been exhausting, and I had spent an extra hour at the office finishing a project. By the time I pulled into the garage, it was almost midnight. The space was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles parked near the elevator. As I turned into my usual parking spot, I noticed something unusual. A man standing near the far end of the garage, half hidden behind a concrete pillar. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his posture too rigid to be casual. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, watching him in my rearview mirror. At first I thought he might be a resident, maybe waiting for a rideshare or someone to pick him up. But something about the way he was standing, stiff, almost unnatural, made my skin crawl. He was too far away for me to make out his features clearly, but his body language screamed tension. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't pacing, wasn't doing anything except standing perfectly still. I tried to shake off the discomfort, reaching for my bag. Maybe he was just lost. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe I was overreacting. Still, I hesitated before getting out of the car. As I opened my door, the sound echoed through the garage. The man twitched, just a small movement, but enough for me to notice. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head in my direction. My heart pounded. He didn't move toward me, didn't say anything. He just stared. I forced myself to act natural, slinging my bag over my shoulder and locking the car with a quick press of my key fob. The beep echoed eerily in the empty space. I kept my movements steady, pretending not to notice him as I walked toward the elevator. The buttons were just a few steps away. If I could get inside, I'd be fine. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not hurried, not casual, just slow, measured steps, closing the distance between us. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, my fingers tightening around my keys. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached the elevator and pressed the button. The light flickered, the doors taking an eternity to respond. The footsteps grew closer. I could feel his presence behind me now, just a few feet away. Then the doors slid open. Relief flooded through me, and I stepped inside quickly, pressing the button for my floor. But just before the doors shut, he spoke. "You live here?" I didn't answer. My hand hovered over the closed door button, but my brain was frozen between fight and flight. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Something in his expression was wrong. The door started closing, but at the last second, he stepped forward. I panicked and jammed the close button repeatedly. The doors finally slid shut, just as he reached the threshold. For a fraction of a second, I saw his face clearly, expressionless, hollow, his eyes locked onto mine. Then he was gone. I pressed my back against the wall of the elevator, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my skin prickled with adrenaline. What the hell had just happened? Once I reached my floor, I practically ran to my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I double-checked the locks. My mind raced through 1,000 explanations. Maybe he was just a weirdo. Maybe he really did live here. Maybe I had imagined the malice in his eyes. But deep down, I knew better. I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. Still, sleep didn't come easy that night. The next day, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Just an uncomfortable encounter. Nothing had actually happened. Until it did. I got home earlier that evening, just as the sun was setting. As I pulled into the garage, I felt a familiar unease creeping in. I scanned the lot, searching for any sign of the man. At first I saw nothing, just the same dim lighting, the same rows of parked cars. Then, movement. A shadow shifting behind a pillar, too far for me to make out clearly. But I knew it was him. I stayed in my car, locking the doors immediately. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, debating whether to call the police. What would I even say? That a man had been standing in the garage 2 nights in a row? He hadn't technically done anything. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped out from behind the pillar and smiled. That was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't, sent a cold wave of terror through me. I turned the key in the ignition so fast my hands slipped. The engine sputtered for a second, and in that second, he started walking toward me. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, my tires screeching against the pavement. I barely slowed as I took the ramp up and out of the garage, my heart hammering in my chest. I never saw him again. That night, I called the building management and reported the incident. They said they'd review the security footage, but I never heard anything back. I never thought twice about parking garages. They were just another part of city life, dimly lit, always a little too quiet, but ultimately harmless. I lived in a high-rise apartment complex in downtown Chicago, and the underground parking garage was a necessary inconvenience. Every day, I followed the same routine: leave work late, take the elevator down to the garage, unlock my car, and drive home. It was always uneventful. Until one night, it wasn't. It was a Wednesday, sometime in early December. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath clouded in front of me as I stepped out of the elevator onto the concrete floor of the parking garage. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the rows of parked cars. There was no one else around. Not unusual. Most people had gone home hours ago. I reached into my pocket, gripping my keys tightly, the metal cold against my palm. Something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the shadows stretched just a little too far under the cars. I quickened my pace. I reached my car, a black sedan parked near the farthest wall. Just as I pressed the unlock button, I saw movement in the side mirror, a shadow shifting behind one of the concrete pillars. I turned quickly, my pulse spiking. Nothing. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. I was just being paranoid. The lights flickered overhead, and I chalked it up to fatigue. Long hours at work, lack of sleep, it was getting to me. I pulled open the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I reached for the ignition, I glanced up. There it was again, a reflection in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the far end of the garage, half hidden behind a pillar, too far away to make out any details. Just standing there, watching. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. I told myself it was just another tenant, maybe someone checking their car. But they weren't moving. They weren't looking at their phone, weren't rummaging for keys, just standing completely still. I turned on the engine. The sound echoed through the garage, but the figure didn't react. I didn't wait to find out more. I shifted into reverse, tires screeching slightly as I pulled out of my parking spot. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The figure was gone. The next day, I convinced myself I had overreacted. Work stress, exhaustion, and overactive imagination. But when I returned to the garage that evening, there was something on my windshield. A note. I hesitated before pulling it off, my fingers trembling slightly. You saw me. My stomach clenched. I scanned the garage, expecting someone to be watching me, but it was empty. The note had no signature, no explanation. I crumpled it in my fist and got into my car, locking the doors immediately. My thoughts raced as I drove home. Was it a joke? Had someone seen my reaction last night and decided to mess with me? Or was it a warning? I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a prank. Maybe some bored teenager or a weird neighbor. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I see you. I shot up, heart hammering against my ribs. My apartment was on the 15th floor. There was no way someone could see me. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtains shut. My breathing was uneven. I didn't sleep that night. The next evening, I considered parking somewhere else, but my assigned space was in the garage, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't actually seen anyone up close. I took the elevator down, my grip on my keys tight. When the door slid open, I stepped out cautiously, my eyes darting around. The garage was empty. I walked quickly to my car, my footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. As I reached for the handle, a sound stopped me. A soft, scuffing noise, like a shoe dragging against the floor. I turned sharply, and my stomach dropped. A figure emerged from behind a parked SUV, dressed in dark clothing, face partially obscured by a hood. They were only a few feet away now, too close. I didn't think. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My fingers fumbled as I hit the lock button. The figure lunged, their hands smacking against the window. I screamed. The engine roared to life as I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I tore out of the garage, nearly clipping another parked car on my way out. My breath came in short gasps, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a crowded gas station miles away. The police took my report but weren't optimistic. No cameras in the garage, no real evidence beyond my word, and a crumpled note. Could be a one-time thing, the officer said, but be careful. I moved out of that apartment complex a month later. But I still think about it. The note, the text message, the hands on the glass. And I wonder, what would have happened if my car hadn't started in time?